I'd like to talk to you today about the role of the child in development. We talk so much about the influences of nature and nurture on children. It sometimes may seem that there's little room for the child. But one of the theorists who really influenced the way that people think about the course of development is Sandra Scar. Here's how Sandra Scar phrased this relationship. She said that we observe correlations between parental characteristics, environments, and children's outcomes. And much of the time, we infer that differences in parental behaviors and environments cause differences in outcomes. And of course, this is a reasonable conclusion to be drawing in many cases. But what Scar pointed out is that in addition to this, each child constructs a reality from the opportunities that are afforded by their rearing environment. And it's this constructed reality that influences variations among children and differences in their outcomes. So, in addition to the influences of parental behaviors on child outcomes, the influences on environments on child outcomes, we need to think about the way in which children are selective and active in creating their environments and how that influences their outcomes. Scar argued that children's influence on their environments shifts with development. She described a shift from what she called evocative influences to passive influences to active influences on development. And she said that this shift happens over the course of development as children become more independent and are increasingly able to choose their own interests and activities. I've illustrated an example of an evocative influence here. Children's temperaments influence the sorts of reactions that they get from other people. So we know that children's temperaments elicit different sorts of interactions with other people, and those interactions with other people can then influence outcomes for them. By comparison, what Scar called a passive outcome might be something like if a parent is interested in reading and has a capability for reading. Scar gave the example that that child might be more surrounded by books as a result, and that being surrounded by books might lead the child to be a better reader. So it's not simply some sort of, simple genetic influence, but the influence of the environment and the child's proclivities will interact with the specifics of what choices the child makes, and then that leads to further outcomes as well. By comparison, you might think of active outcomes as choices that children are making about the specific things that they want to spend time doing. And if you're a parent and you've wanted your child to learn some particular skill, you're probably very familiar with this. Let's just say that the skill that you want your child to learn is piano. And let's say that the skill that your child seems interested in learning is gaming. So as your child becomes older and more independent, they increasingly exert influence over the choice of how they spend their time. And in many cases, that may mean that they spend more and more time gaming and less time playing piano. And that influences children's outcomes because obviously we all know from studies of expertise that the more time that you spend practicing those skills, the better you become at them. So I hope that shift from evocative to passive to active is roughly clear to you. And that comes from Sandra Scar. It's not from me. So imitation is a really nice example, I think, of how children are actually involved in their choices and in what they're learning because we know that it's an active process. Well, how do we know that it's an active process? Well, imitation isn't simply blindly copying what we see in our environment. It's some sort of selective process, and we know this from a series of studies that Harold Beckering and Andy Wohlschläger and I did many years ago, in which we showed children a number of different sorts of gestures, and what we found was that children selectively copied different aspects of the gestures. And our account of that was that children had a kind of goal-based description of actions that they observed, and what they copied when they reproduced actions was what they perceived the goals of actions to be. We know that from other sorts of stimuli as well. So for example, Harriet Over did a study with me in which she played for children recordings of sentences that had either grammatical repetitions or ungrammatical repetitions. And I confess I always had a little bit of difficulty detecting which of them were the ungrammatical repetitions, but Harriet assured me that children would be able to tell the difference. And what we found was that children selectively deleted the ungrammatical repetitions when they copied the sentences. We then played the sentences for them either from an active agent or from essentially not an agent, a box. I hope you notice how much the box looks like the frog there. And what we found was that children showed this selectivity in their imitation only with respect to what they perceived to be an active agent. By comparison, when they copied something that they perceived to be not having agency, they copied everything more literally. So imitation is an active process in that our inferences about the environment around us influences what we attend to and then what we learn from our environment. Interestingly, though, it's not just in childhood that we can observe this kind of phenomenon. So we know from a number of different studies, including in other labs, that infants show selective imitation. And I'll tell you just a couple of studies from my own lab. So for example, we know that infants selectively copy actions that they perceive to be intentional and omit actions that they perceive to be accidental. We know that they can use prosody to make this distinction between intentional and accidental actions. So Elena Sakalou in the upper picture there showed infants different sorts of toys that had multiple affordances, and she marked one of those with a Greek word that had an intentional intonation, so prosodic contour, and another action she marked with a Greek word, so a word that children weren't familiar with, so no linguistic information available to them, with a accidental prosodic contour. And what she found when she gave the children the box was that children selectively performed the action that was accompanied by this prosodic contour that communicates intentions, and they were less likely to do the action that was accompanied by a contour that tells us about accidents. Children were able to do this around their first birthday. We know that this is also, however, stable across tasks. It's not something that's simply specific to prosody. So in another study, Elena gave children that same task, and she gave them another task that distinguished between different sorts of actions. And I'm not going to go into as much detail here, but I'm just going to jump ahead and tell you that this didn't use prosody or indeed any form of utterance to communicate to children at all. The experimenter simply hopped an animal across a board, and we used different sorts of experimental conditions to distinguish between different settings. And again, we were interested in whether children would selectively copy actions that they perceived as intentional. And again, that was the case. We knew this already from Melinda Carpenter's study, which was the original study we were copying here. But importantly, what we found was that by the first birthday, performance across these two tasks was stable. So that tells us that infants are really capable of this in some deeper manner. So the idea that one of the ways that children can shape their own development is having a selective approach to their environment and learning from their environment through some sort of selectivity. And the fact that we can observe this during infancy really challenges Scar's claim that essentially we have a passive infant who becomes an active child. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today, to give you some longitudinal data that has helped us evaluate in what ways children might be selective about their environments and how that might influence learning outcomes for them. And I'm going to tell you in sort of 3 different chunks here. Much of what I'll talk about now is focused on joint attention. And joint attention is a really great candidate for active engagement for children. Joint attention, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is simply the notion that we frequently attend to some aspect of the environment or some other person in the environment together with another person. We share attention to that aspect of the environment, and by sharing it, we communicate something about the environment. We use other people's attention to learn words. We use other people's attention to draw inferences about words. And so it's clearly an active process. Importantly, attention is also this kind of selective process, though. So Robert Desimone reminded us yesterday that attention has the effect of reducing visual clutter. And so essentially, that attention is a great candidate for something that reduces the environment from total to some specific aspect that the child's learning might focus on. We also know that there's some relationship between joint attention and outcomes for children. So for example, there have been a number of studies that have looked at the ways in which parents might support joint attention. Some parents are more responsive to their child's attentional state than other parents, and for example, might choose to talk about the object that they see their child currently attending to. Those kinds of maternal contributions to joint attention, or what later in the talk I'm going to call maternal following in, influence language development. In most studies that have looked at this, the way in which it influences language development is indexed by vocabulary size. That's the way I'm going to talk about it later, or in particular, vocabulary growth. So I'll start opposite from Laura's schema. I'm going to start with the youngest studies of all and sort of work up a little bit from there. So opposite direction, partly because these are longitudinal studies where we're moving with the baby. So we know from studies, not only from my own lab, but also from Darwin Muir's lab, that infants are capable of attention following from 3 months, as long as the task is set up in such a way that it accounts for the infant's visual capabilities. So what you see right there is a very good example of a scenario that accounts for the infant's visual capabilities. The infant is very close to the experimenter. The scene is very proximal. The 2 puppets that you see are the targets for the infant, and they're clearly very proximal to the experimenter's head. So in other words, the potential targets are already within the infant's field of vision when the infant is looking at the face of the experimenter. The experimenter simply makes turns in a predetermined order to one target or the other, and the way that we assess whether the infant is capable of attention following is simply whether the turns to the correct target exceed all the other categories of possibility. So turning to the opposite target, turning away from the scene altogether, or continuing to look at the experimenter's face. When we did a longitudinal study where we tested infants on a monthly basis on this task, from 1 month to 4 months, what we found was that at the group level, infants first showed this ability at 3 months. It would be possible, however, that the infant response in this scenario could be something that's really exogenously controlled. So we might think of it as really a kind of attention orienting rather than attention following. We know from follow-up analyses, however, that this process is endogenously controlled. Sorry, now I'm not sure if I just said exogenously controlled or not. So just to go back a little bit, so it could be the case that the infant's behavior here is exogenously controlled. It's all a very proximal scenario, and it could just be, for instance, the motion that cues the infant to the correct target. And we would think of that as being an exogenously controlled attentional process. And I just realized, I'm sorry, the amazing thing for me is that I learned those concepts from Nancy Conwisher when I was a PhD student at UCLA. So thank you, Nancy, I bet neither one of us knew at the time how much you would influence my thinking. So what we looked at was the subsequent behavior of the infant to assess whether or not the infant was in control of the situation. And what we did was the experimenter actually held that turn for 10 seconds. So the experimenter continued to look at the target for 10 more seconds, and we simply assessed what the infant did in the subsequent period while the experimenter was no longer moving. And what you can see here, let's see if I can cue it for you, is the infant, this is the first movement. The infant shifted to the correct trial. The infant then shifts back to the experimenter's face, back to the target, the correct puppet, and then back to the experimenter's face, this time with a somewhat skeptical look, I think. And so we use that checking back sequence as an indicator that the infant is actually endogenously controlling this process of attention following. One more test that we did to be a little bit more certain about the infant's capability being what was important here was we also filmed in that same longitudinal study infants interacting with their mothers. And we used a coding scheme that's well established that was developed by Roger Bakeman to look at the sophistication of infants' attentional states. And I'm not going to tell you about it in detail, but I'll just tell you that the most sophisticated of the attentional states that we felt that infants at this age would be capable of is something that Bakeman calls passive joint engagement. It's a highly supported state. You can see that the mother is really creating an opportunity for joint attention there. The infant doesn't really need to show any awareness of the mother's attention at all. The infant only needs to pay attention to the thing that the mother is paying attention to in order to get credit for passive joint engagement. And we created a variable that we called the stability of passive joint engagement between 3 and 4 months, and we compared that against the checking back on the experimental measure that I just described to you. And what we found was that children who showed more stable, sophisticated forms of attention engagement were also children who did better on the experimental measure of attention following. So that gives us some indication that infants' selectivity of attention can actually influence what they're gaining from different sorts of environments. It doesn't yet tell us very much about infant outcomes. Before I step ahead to infant outcomes like language, I'm going to step back instead a little bit and tell you a little bit about what we've learned since then about the origins of this attention following ability. Relatively little is known about the ontogeny of attention following, and that may be one reason why the most popular theoretical explanation of attention following is that it happens around 9 months. And we were really interested in, given that we had identified attention following reliably at an earlier age, we were interested in what might precede that attention following. I'm going to draw on 2 of the talks from yesterday to explain them, and I hope I don't start a war between the faces people and the actions people, but it turned out to be fantastic that people talked about the importance of faces and the importance of actions for processing yesterday, so I'm going to refer to those. So a really popular, but I would say implicit rather than explicitly stated hypothesis about the origins of attention following is that attention to faces is something that's innately programmed. And one reason why it might be innately programmed is because it leads us by paying attention to people's faces to follow where those faces are looking. It's actually very difficult to find this explicitly stated anywhere in the literature, but you don't need to talk to anyone very long about attention following and its origins to arrive at a point where they say, surely that's what happens. Winrich, I promised him I would say his name correctly. Winrich talked to us yesterday about the fact that faces seem to play a very, very important role in getting cognition going, not simply as faces alone, but also because they seem to influence a lot of the other learning that happens. So it's possible, in other words, that that kind of early attention to faces might lead to some sort of outcome. By comparison, studies with adults suggest another hypothesis, and that hypothesis is that attention to actions might be a very, very important bias that people and even adults and even infants have, and that attention to actions might play a special role in orienting. So in a subsequent longitudinal study, we wanted to test this hypothesis using the experimental paradigm that I've already told you about, but also looking a little bit earlier at the role of infant attention as an indicator of their subsequent attention following. Here's how we did that. We filmed the mother and the infant interacting in a very rich but calming environment for the infant. When you run a longitudinal study with monthly testing from 1 to 18 months, my primary recommendation is lots and lots of piloting, because what you need is that once the infant gets to your laboratory, not only are they not asleep or not feeding or not crying, but once they're in your testing scenario, they need to finish that testing. And so we tested in advance for different ways that we might observe the interaction. And this turned out to be really fantastic. We bought a kind of festival tent that had a lovely visual pattern on it. It created a very calming environment for the mother and the infant, a kind of sense of privacy. And we filmed them in there for 10 minutes. We then used the coding system that Mark Bornstein developed that is a moment-by-moment coding of attentional states, whereby social partners are coded independently and then combined to make assessments of their attention. And in this case, we just looked at the infant attention. And we looked at infant attention to 3 different categories: infant attention to faces, infant attention to the actions that the mother performed, and infant attention to something else, which frequently turned out to be the patterning on the tent. At 2 months, that was an especially engaging visual stimulus for the infant. We then administered our attention following task at 5 months, and we did it at 5 months so that we would find infants at a slightly more mature period in their development of attention following, and we used the number of sequences of checking back, so that interval between looking at the correct target back to the experimenter's face and back to the correct target. So the number of times that they made that shift we used as a dependent variable. So it gave us a continuous dependent variable, a much nicer and more sensitive way of looking at this. And what we found then was that it was surprisingly, in many ways, not attention to faces at 2 months that predicted that kind of checking back behavior at 5 months, but rather it was infant attention to the mother's actions that was predictive of the number of times that they repeated that checking back sequence at 5 months. So that gives us really just a very first hint, I think, about the origins of attention following, and it gives us some information about ways that the selectivity of the attention of the infant might influence their outcomes. Now, I don't want to say that some infants are going to acquire attention following and other infants aren't, but I think what we're seeing here is that infants who spent more time attending to actions were quicker to acquire more sophisticated forms of attention following. And that's really true for most of our developmental studies. So now I'd like to shift gears just a little bit and tell you about ways in which infant contributions to specific joint attention episodes shape a very different kind of outcome. And we're going to use the traditional outcome of vocabulary size or vocabulary growth in particular to look at it. So this is from the same longitudinal study. Don't forget, I spent my life with these families and a large staff, spent really all our time with these families for a period of about 3 years because we were testing them month by month. And so this analysis we conducted on the interaction at 14 months. At 14 months, we have a very different scenario. Our health and safety committee felt that it was important that we keep the children away from all the cords, hence that nice little wall you see back there. So it's a very different kind of environment. Here, what we were interested in coding was, again, I should say we used Mark Bornstein's state coding for attention, where the mother's attention and the infant's attention are coded completely throughout the entire interaction independently, and then you combine them using sequential analysis to find out information. So we defined two variables. What you can see, this is not a sequence, of course, but what you can really see here, I think you can infer, is that this is very likely to be a situation in which the mother holds up a toy, and so the mother has essentially initiated this particular episode. The mother attends to a toy, and then what you can see here is that the infant is attending to it. Now, this is really just one moment in time, the image that I'm showing you, but I am pretty confident that that's what happened here. So the sequential analysis can help us define that variable, which I'm going to call infant follow-in, because the mother attended first, and then the infant followed. That's actually a variable, however surprising it may seem, that no one's really looked at in this particular scenario, because what people have always looked at is the way that maternal follow-in or paternal follow-in influences children's outcomes. So here we were interested in creating a level playing ground for comparing maternal follow-in, that well-known predictor of vocabulary growth, with infant follow-in, so essentially a measure of the infant's capabilities, and compare that against maternal follow-in. So in order to do that, we collected CDIs at 14, 16, 17, and 18 months. We used those to look at the relationships between our two variables, maternal follow-in and infant follow-in, and vocabulary. And I'm sorry, I see this is tiny, but I'll read it to you. These are the CDI scores correlated with maternal follow-in, and actually only one of these is significant. So we don't overall see a significant relationship. There's some relationship there, but overall not significant. We then looked at the relationship between CDIs and infant follow-in, and we observed here significant relationships. They actually look like exactly the same graph to me, but I'm confident they're not. So there we observed significant relationships between infant follow-in and vocabulary size at each month. We then used growth curve modeling to test the predictive power of infant versus maternal follow-in on vocabulary growth. And what we found was the infant follow-in at 14 months predicted vocabulary growth from 14 to 18 months. When we added maternal follow-in, it did not improve the infant model. If we treated it as the primary variable, it could predict vocabulary growth independently, but in addition to the infant model, it didn't. By comparison, if we would treat the model the other way around, infant follow-ins add significant value to the prediction of vocabulary growth. So what we infer from this, in other words, is that that joint attention situation, which we've known for a long time is playing an important role in language learning, isn't just a situation created by parents, it's a situation that's resulting from infant capabilities as well. And by measuring infant follow-in and maternal follow-in in comparable ways, which had never been done before, we were able then to say which one of them is a better predictor of vocabulary growth. And here what we see is that infant follow-in is a better predictor. So if I may, I'll keep you for just a few more minutes. I promise not to keep you too long from your lunch. And I'll tell you about just one more set of findings that are about infant contributions to language. And I think they're related to joint attention, even though only one of the variables that I'm going to tell you about is traditionally thought of as a joint attention variable. But I'd like to place it in a slightly different context and help you think of the active infant. And Fabio just told me that he has a baby who's 6 months old. And I said, oh, that's a great age because they can't move around yet. Because once infants move around, then they're really exploring their environments. And so we started to think about ways in which exploring environments might influence language outcomes. We used our same longitudinal data set to examine this, and now I'm going to tell you about an entirely different kind of way that we were assessing these families. The real reason that we were keeping these families so close to us for 18 months was that we were developing and testing a new way of collecting data outside of the laboratory. And I applaud the work that Laura and Josh are doing. That's really fantastic. Developmentalists and really anyone who's collecting human data needs to be thinking about how to collect data outside of the laboratory. What you can see from our photograph here is that we were starting this a few generations ago. right after I got the grant, then iPhones came out. But the budget allowed for me to purchase Palm Pilots for parents. So we stuck with Palm Pilots. So what we did was we developed an electronic diary method that trained parents to recognize particular behaviors of their infant and to record them in this diary system. We saw the infants on a monthly basis so that researchers could be constantly testing the milestones that parents were meant to be detecting and recording, and that enabled us to assess the validity of this method. And I'm not going to tell you about it now. I've got a reference there, and I'll just tell you that it turned out to be a pretty spectacular method. For the most part, parents are pretty accurate at recognizing milestones in their infant's development, and you get more well-formed data, not surprisingly, from ongoing constant evaluation that parents can do because they're always with their infant, compared to researchers testing infants on a monthly basis. And no healthcare system, or researcher for that matter, can afford to test infants on a monthly basis over the long term. It was pretty exhausting, and I'm not planning on it again. So, you know, this gives us a real potential for assessing infants in a very different way. I'm only going to talk to you about a few milestones here. So we measured a wide variety of motor milestones, communicative milestones, and what we called cognitive milestones. We were particularly interested in imitation. But here I'm just going to tell you about the relationships that we investigated between motor milestones and vocabulary growth. So this is that same set of vocabulary data that I've already told you about. And here what we looked at was which motor milestones might predict vocabulary growth subsequently, or vocabulary size. And we used linear mixed effect modeling to look at the relationship, for instance, between pointing, something that's a motor milestone, but also a really classic index of joint attention. And what we found, not surprisingly, was that infants who point earlier have higher CDI production scores, and the effect is stronger for the CDI scores at later ages. So that's exactly what we would expect to see for a joint attention behavior. The infants who are showing more mature joint attention are also showing more rapid vocabulary growth. We then looked at other sorts of motor milestones that you might not conventionally think of as joint attention. So let's think of them very broadly as being about exploration of the environment. So the earliest one that we looked at as a predictor that was a predictor was pincer grip. So pincer grip is a very tiny motion. It doesn't seem that important, but once the child is capable of pincer grip, not only can they hold on to objects, but they can also release objects. And furthermore, they can explore more specific aspects of objects as well. So we found the same sort of relationship between pincer grip and CDI scores as with pointing and CDI scores. Infants who showed the pincer grip earlier had higher production scores, and the effect was stronger at later ages. The same relationship held for walking. We're not the first to observe this relationship with walking, but very neatly, we're the first to be able to show the relationship not only holds for walking, but across a range of motor milestones. And walking has this very special effect that not only does it allow a child to really explore the environment, to access new objects of interest and so on, but it also allows a child to carry objects, to bring objects to someone who might, for instance, then name them in response. And in fact, we know from work that was done in Karen Adolph's lab that once a child begins walking, that parents engage in more naming for their children. So we know that there's some effect of the infant capabilities on the parental environment for the child, in other words. To really test that just a little bit more, we then compared exactly the same relationship with crawling. Now, crawling lets you get around in the world, it lets you get to objects, but what it doesn't really let you do is carry objects around. If you don't believe me, just try it. It's pretty difficult getting around on your hands and knees and also bringing objects with you. And indeed, again, data from Karen Adolph's lab and from Lana Karasik indicates that infants are not bringing objects when they're crawling to their parents as much as once they're walking. So we looked at this relationship, and here we wouldn't expect to see a relationship with CDI scores, and indeed, we did not. We also looked at one more motor milestone, and this motor milestone seems trivial probably, but it was also very important to us, and that was that we wanted to look at a reflex behavior. So we looked at the palmar grasp. We see some variability in when parents report the palmar grasp because some parents are more conscientious about observing and reporting things. But really importantly, it shouldn't be that these kinds of relationships are about very eager parents reporting their child is very good at everything and therefore accounting for these kinds of relationships. And so we really should see no relationship between the palmar grasp and vocabulary. And indeed, that was the case. No relationship at all. So I've started by talking to you about children as active contributors to their own development and tried to show you that this isn't just a developmental shift that appears during childhood, it's also something that we can observe and test during infancy. Infants are selective in their responses to the environment. We can see this through their imitation. We can see this through their performance on attention tasks. We can see this through their engagement with their parents. And furthermore, what's very important is that infants' choices and actions allow them to shape their own development. And we can look at a range of different kinds of processes as developmental outcomes to test this. So, is it the case that children develop from passive infants to active children? No, we really have to think about the fact that we have an active infant developing into an active child. This is really just the very beginning for us, but I think it's a very exciting set of ideas for us to be testing, and I hope lots of other people will be interested in testing as well. That already during infancy, children are capable of shaping their outcomes. So many people were involved in that terrible monthly testing and lots of other analyses. So I want to say thank you to them and to Ulrike Hahn, who guided all the growth curve modeling that we did. This was a tremendous commitment from all of the participants in the longitudinal studies, and so I never ever forget to thank the families who took part. And it required quite a bit of funding as well, including the very first longitudinal study was actually funded by the National Research Council of Italy, so it's a nice circle. So thank you.